Hello, everybody. I'm Robert Rose. Thank you so much for having me at the Content Strategy Collective event. I'm super excited to be here and super excited that you're here. Hopefully one of these days we're all going to get back in person together, so I'm really hopeful for that. What I'd love to do over the next 29 minutes or so is just talk to you a little bit about what we're seeing in the world of content marketing in 2022 and how it's been disrupted. And really the idea of building fans as opposed to followers. If you don't know who I am, again, my name is Robert Rose, and I work with brands all over the world to help them operationalize the idea of content marketing. I also serve as the Chief Strategy Advisor for the Content Marketing Institute, where I perform research, and I've got a couple of books and podcasts and all that kind of stuff that we need not go into. But if you want to connect with me, there's my email address. Would love to hear from each and every one of you and connect on LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever you'd like to make that connection. But let's just jump right in, because this is an important topic and one that I'm super excited to talk to you about. And I think we can all agree the last couple of years have left us in a place of, well, let's just call it, things are a little fluxed up right now as we look at it. You got to say that really slow to make sure that you don't mess anything up. But things are really changing very, very quickly. Even every day, it feels more and more fluid as we try and deal with the strategies, the content, the business, the marketing, all the things that we're trying to keep up with as we come out of the pandemic, as we enter into an uncertain economy and all of those kinds of things. And I think it was best summed up by Satya Nadella in Microsoft from really the middle of the pandemic when you think about it. And what he said was that they'd seen 2 years of digital transformation in the last 2 months. And that resonates so much with me. I don't know about you, but when we talk to clients all over the world, they're talking about this, right? How much the last 2 years have really disrupted the idea of the digital transformation for sure, but more importantly, how we're actually delivering messaging, content, communication to customers. That has changed. And what we've seen over the last 2 years, and all of the brands that you see on the screen right there, are certainly companies that we've worked with over the last few years and have seen this change, are 4 disruptions that I want to touch on in a way that maybe makes sense and starts to provide some lessons for us as we start moving forward. The first one of that is, of course, consumer time shifting. Now, we can hopefully put the goldfish to bed, right? We don't need the goldfish anymore. We have more of an attention span than a goldfish. Let's just debunk that right now. It is not our attention spans that have shrunk. It is our appetite or patience for interruptive-based content, even down to the fact, where telephones, right? We don't even take inbound calls, even from people we know any longer. I mean, have you seen that, right? You get a call from someone, you're like, how dare, they didn't even text me before they called me. They're calling me in the middle of this. And so it's not just any kind of content. It is any kind of messaging, full stop. Interruptive-based is just no tolerance for it. Cold calling, inbound, all of those kinds of things. If we didn't ask for it, it's not really wanted. And so what are the implications of that is that we're going to have to get much better around holding attention, because once we get it, it's absolutely precious. The second, which relates to that, is this idea that we've been calling the supply-induced physical presence scarcity. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying that the physical presence, in other words, getting together with a client and standing at the foot of the table and being able to deliver a PowerPoint presentation, or sitting at a conference, or sitting in a cafe with a client and going through an iPad presentation, all of those things are really lessened these days. And the reason that they're lessened is because we value our physical presence much more than we did 2 years ago. In other words, it puts implications on the physical presence, like it needs to be really compelling before I get on a plane or actually go in a car and visit that particular physical space. And it puts real pressure on the digital experiences. Because what it means, of course, is that the digital experiences now have to act as a proxy to the physical experiences that were once there. And we've started to see a lot of this when it comes to sales enablement, sales content, search engine optimization strategies, etc. How do we make our digital experiences a proxy for what used to be a physical experience? The third disruption is really this idea of the democratization of digital content. Because of the pressure put on the digital experience, well, we've all been the noise, right? We're all in that social media noise that we see now and trying to pierce that noise of all the content getting poured out there. And that's only getting worse. The ability for us to publish, distribute, and market content is only getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Whereas now we see that competition becoming so hard that now we actually have to differentiate against each other, because we're creating multiple experiences for these customers and digital experiences. So we have to make sure that we're not only competing against our competitors, but against that last great experience that they created, which might have been ours. So it's a really interesting time to be thinking about managing all this digital content. And the last, but certainly not the least, probably the place I spend most of my time these days, is the decline of trust and truth. And you feel this, right? We feel it in the culture. We feel it everywhere we go. The trust and the decline of truth in terms of mainstream media, including government, including all of our institutions, has just become at an all-time low. And so where that leaves us as brands, interestingly, and we'll talk a little more about this, is that we are the last trusted institution. So while that says interesting things about our culture, it gives us as marketers a unique opportunity to become the trusted source of interesting things for our consumers. So these 4 disruptions we're seeing across a broad swath of different kinds of clients and all kinds of businesses. So what does it mean? Well, in the shortest stint, it means hello content marketing strategy. I mean, we've seen it, right? We've seen content marketing become an incredibly important piece of what it is we do as businesses. And if you even look at the CMO's top priorities these days, the top 6 of them have everything to do with content. Whether it's social media, targeting content, video content, content marketing, content management, video, all of it is really coming to bear as it pertains to where we are focused our efforts. And so maybe no better example than this when we can start to see somebody like James Merlino, who is the Chief Experience Officer at Cleveland Clinic. And of course, Cleveland Clinic understands content and content marketing better than just about every organization on the planet. But one of the things that he said recently is that the developments of the last 2 years has put a unique opportunity on the table. What he said was our constituents are no longer just patients, consumers, or customers. Appropriately, they're our partners. We need them to help us by taking care of themselves and understanding not only their disease, but the environment in which they are treated. We now have the tools to create empowered, equipped, educated, engaged, and I got to say I love his alliteration there, equipped, educated, engaged, and expert patients while also making sure that they are heard. And what he was referring to is, of course, the content experiences that they're creating through their blog, through their health library, through all of the digital content experiences that they are creating. We have that same opportunity now to co-create experiences with our customers to enable them to become better customers, more loyal, etc. That's the opportunity we have. But here's the trick. Your content, it provides 0 competitive advantage. That's right. Your content provides no competitive advantage, because here's the thing. Even if you are good enough to create something that goes completely viral, that completely differentiates you, it will be about 10.5 seconds before your competitor has come up with the exact same thing or a copy. A strategic operation of content, however, might just be the thing that differentiates you in the mind of the consumer. And why? Your customer obviously doesn't care about your operation, but what it is your operation enables you to create a consistent, scalable, efficient, effective content strategy over the long haul. That is a competitive advantage over the viral moments that you might have at random. And so that gets us to our first idea or set of ideas. The idea of building fans, not followers. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we can go back, and we can go back 20 years to the last time we were in some uncertain economic territory here, with digital really playing a disruptive role, and that, of course, was the 1999 to 2002 dot-com era. And there was an interesting book written by James Heskett called The Service Profit Chain, and what he talked about in that book was that satisfaction isn't enough any longer. What he meant by that was you have to create what he then called apostles, evangelists, people who would talk about your brand, your product, your experience that you created. And what he meant by that was, and on the chart on the right, you can see this, the idea was you are always going to have customers who buy your product and then end up in what he called the zone of defection. Customers that don't like what you did, don't like your product, basically defect from your product. And he said that's just part of doing business. He said the danger these days is to create what he called customers that were squarely in that zone of indifference, where they had a satisfied experience, but they don't do anything with it. They basically don't cross-sell, they don't upsell, they don't evangelize your product or service to their friends and family. He said the mandate today was to create apostles, evangelists, people who would talk about your product in an interesting way. And that was key, he said. And he said the part of this, and the reason he called it the service profit chain, was because the key link in that was making it an organizational capability, not just one person. In other words, you had to enable frontline workers to create these wonderful experiences and be able to think outside the box and have the tools, training, knowledge available to them to be able to create that at scale so that you could create these surprising, delightful moments. Well, the same thing exists today. We call it building fans, not followers. And what I mean by that is that with our content strategy, it is no longer good enough to simply answer the question. Now, this proves true both for SEO from a Google ranking perspective, as well as from the human interaction perspective. It is no longer good enough to simply be the FAQ of our particular industry. You can't just settle bar bets with your content. You must hold the attention. You must hold the engagement so that you build a fan, someone who takes an action, shares the article, comments on it, emails someone about it, evangelizes that particular piece of content, and it stretches over the entirety of the buyer's journey. And feeding from Heskett's idea, the key is that this is an organizational strategy. In other words, content strategy these days must be more than just a siloed organization of teams producing assets for the website. It must be an enabling strategy that enables salespeople, executives, account services, all of the personnel to tell a consistent, holistic story. That's the only way that content ultimately scales, is if it becomes an organizational capability. Now, the key here also with Heskett is that the danger zone isn't that zone of abandonment. You may find that people unsubscribe from your newsletter or unsubscribe or troll you on social media or whatever it is. The danger zone is what we call the zone of passivity. That's where you have an email list of 20,000 or a social media following where dutifully every Friday you send that email or post that social media post and nothing happens. Nobody takes an action. Everybody gets it. Everybody subscribes still, but nothing happens. This is where content is its most useless, when it feeds into an apathetic audience that doesn't really do anything about it. You've got to create fans, people who will ultimately share your content and evangelize your content and talk about it. So here, four quick lessons learned in the journey that we're on today. The first one is that content is a team sport. You've got to evangelize and create an organizational capability for content marketing, and content strategy. It is not enough to simply be the internal agency to produce assets for various teams. 2, the experiences must be connected. In other words, if you're connecting subscriptions to an email newsletter, to your blog, to your resource center, and then ultimately to your customer, and those are separate databases or separate areas, you need to fix that. If I have to register once for your blog, another for your resource center, and another to become a customer, you're doing it wrong. We've got to connect these experiences so that we can have a holistic look at our customer's journey so that we can see how we're holding attention throughout the entirety of the journey. 3, consider differentiating on how to change rather than if you should change. In other words, instead of pouring more content into the noise about why someone should change or the industry trending, leading things that we need to change the paradigm of this, how about if we start delivering how to change so that we start differentiating on our ability to help customers actually do something rather than why they should do something? And then last but certainly not least here is build content that is acted on. Build fans, people who want to take action on your content, not simply followers who sit in apathetic silence listening to your content and never doing anything about it. There is always a best next action, a call to action on every piece of content, no matter what it is. All right, great example of this. Our friends at ServiceNow, great company, wonderful technology company, and they built a magazine. And the magazine is called Workflow Quarterly. I love this because it's not something that they do daily or weekly or even monthly. They produce this magazine quarterly. And the reason it's differentiated is because they take the time to get the high quality. They get thought leaders, C-suite, discussing their personal experiences with workflow management. Yeah, that's right. They're making workflow management sexy. They've got third-party experts coming in, talking about exclusive content, building in that value. And they operate a little bit like a media company, looking at media and attention metrics, how they're holding and driving actions with the people who are coming in. So their big successes, well, they got a 66% growth in subscribers to their quarterly magazine, and lovely, that's nice. You might think that's a lovely vanity metric, but here's the thing. What they found is, by being able to segment that out, engaged audiences, in other words, audiences that just come and consume the content without subscribing, well, they're 5 times more likely to fill out a lead form. However, subscribers are 73% more likely to fill out a lead form at some point. So it's playing the long game, not only just engaging audiences, but building those audiences in for the long game to build them as leads. That gets us to the second piece, which is audiences, not just visitors. So if we go beyond fans and followers, it's about building audiences, not just visitors to our media. Now, what does that mean? Well, we go back to our purpose as marketers, as communicators. So of course, it's to reach audiences. And of course, we want to move those audiences through a funnel into becoming customers. But building audiences? Are we really building audiences? Well, I go back to the 1950s, and here we can look to a great classic B2B ad, the man in the chair ad. Now, you might not be familiar with the man in the chair ad, but it's one of the classic B2B advertising that really launched the idea of advertising as a valuable option for B2B companies. And what the man in the chair ad said, because that copy is a little small to read, is you had a stern-looking grandpa who's the CEO of a company looking out at you saying, I don't know who you are. I don't know what you stand for. I don't know your customers. I don't know your products. And so what was it you wanted to sell me again? Basically, the idea was you have to educate your customers before your salespeople call on them in order to drive that value. Advertising being an optimal way to do that. Well, we're still there. We're still there with the man in the chair. We just have ultimately multiple channels to be able to do that. We have to do it through digital, email, web, social, etc. We have to educate our customers on who we are, what we stand for, our customers, and why we're important in the marketplace before a salesperson ever calls. The way to do that is to start to build them as engaged audiences. So when we think about that, I want you to think like a media company. Now here's the thing. We talk about acting like a media company all the time. We say, let's act like a media company. Let's work like a media company. And the pushback on that is, well, media companies don't market themselves like we do, and we don't market ourselves like media companies. That's not what we mean. We don't mean market like a media company. What we mean is actually treat content and the building of audiences in the same operational strategy that media companies do. Here's a great example of that. What you see on this graph is a fascinating chart, maybe one of my favorite charts of the last couple of years. The blue line represents the number of streaming networks that are still operating with the idea of dropping full seasons, binge watching a show, much like happened with the House of Cards, where they dropped the entire season on one day and you could binge watch the whole thing. You can see that number is going down and down and down. The orange line represents streaming networks that are dropping things week by week or on a regular basis, keeping you to stay tuned. That's the key. There's going to be very soon a crossover of that, where you're starting to see all streaming networks launch things that are week by week by week, not in any sort of binge watching way. Why? Because they're learning that it is about holding attention over the long haul instead of delivering binge watchable material where people come in, they binge, and then they turn off and they never think about that streaming network again. That's incredibly important to their business model, and it's incredibly important to us. We need to start taking the same opportunity in our resource centers, in our blog, in our webinar programs, building ecosystems where people want to live, where they want to be an audience, rather than simply visit or binge watch based on a project they have. Creating digital scarcity, keeping them coming back over time, a loyal audience over time that builds value. Think in terms of how one program creates a sustained audience rather than how it gathers the biggest audience in one swell swoop and ultimately loses them just as quickly. The secret to all of that is planning. We have to start planning our content. In other words, when we start thinking about a webinar program, rather than going, well, what are we going to talk about Friday? We'll talk about this. And then not thinking about the next Friday and the following Friday and the following Friday until the following Monday, that's key, because we're not building a program then. We're not building a series. We're building just ad hoc webinars and programming them the way we are. The key there is that in webinar number 1, I want to tee up webinar number 2, and I want to tee up webinar number 3 so that you subscribe to my webinar program, not just a webinar. In other words, I want you to subscribe to my blog, not just view one blog post. The idea here is to start to separate this idea of planning content, where we plan the content and then figure out what the assets that we're going to produce out of that content are. See, what we typically do is we think, we come up with an idea and we go right to the container, right to, we need a webinar, we need a white paper, we need an ebook, we need a web page. And instead, what I want you to think of is we're going to create a series, a story that unfolds over the course of a month, a quarter, a year. Then we're going to build that content. Then we're going to figure out all the assets and containers that may contain that story. That's the key to a content strategy, not just random acts of content. So, a few lessons to learn here, getting us to 8 total lessons. So lesson number 5, content governance strategy. Build around a planning and prioritization strategy, a strategy that focuses in on building a series, a subscriber, an audience, looking forward rather than just serving the needs of an on-demand content vending machine to the rest of the business. 6, audience persona research. Think about, how do I research my audience? Not just buyers, but how do I start to deliver value beyond the buying experience? 7, slowing down the creation process, thinking about it the long game, the long term, the series. How do I start thinking about a series of webinars that I program rather than simply ad hoc elements of relatively disconnected content, so that we can exponentially increase the reuse, the repackaging, all the different containers that content might live in. And number 8, building audiences that want to hear from you. That's the key, building subscribers, not just visitors to our ecosystem when we're trying to drive demand for some project. Don't be afraid of conscious experiences. This is a great example of what I'm just talking about here. So this is SAP, and they had a blog, and their blog was around customer experience and all the things that you might, expect it to be, software and e-commerce and email and all the things that we do in customer experience. But they did something very interesting during COVID. What they did was that they started to see that, customer experience and software, not terribly relevant in this moment. So they took the time to say, what we're here to do is not just deliver customer experience content to audiences, we're here to deliver value to an audience. So they changed the editorial strategy. They changed and repositioned the editorial to be COVID specific. They partnered with Johns Hopkins University, and they started producing all kinds of content specific to this audience that's valuable to this audience related to COVID-19. Now, an interesting thing happened when they did this. They saw a 200% growth in traffic. Lovely, very nice, good case study for some SEO agency somewhere. But interestingly, their SEO dropped 91% to 71% SEO traffic, right? 30% increase, however, and this is the important part, in return traffic, increased subscription, increased lead generation. Why? Because they dropped, of course they did, because they started not focusing on their keywords in SEO, but the audience that was there started coming back because they trusted that resource. It became a trusted resource for them, so of course they stayed. Now that they're rebalancing the editorial back to software and customer experience and all of those sorts of things, guess what? They've kept that audience. So don't be afraid to change to continue to deliver value to your audience just because it might not be what you originally started as. That gets us to the third and last, leaning into emotional data gleaned from trusted experiences. What I mean by that is that we need to build trust and truth back into our content. Very interesting this year, Edelman did its trust barometer for like the 12th year in a row. Amazing piece of content, by the way, if you haven't read it. I loved the headline here. The headline in the trust barometer this year was that societal leadership is now a core function of business. That's an important thing. As we start thinking about issues, topics, content that we want to create, societal leadership is not only an opportunity for us with audiences, audiences now expect it. Why? Because weirdly, business has become the most trusted institution. When they did their trust barometer this year, what they found was interesting that media, government, all fell in the lower left-hand quadrant of considered both unethical as well as less competent. NGOs, nonprofits, etc., fell into the ethical but less competent, and business was the only institution that fell into the right quadrant, which is considered both ethical and competent. And again, we can have a good bottle of scotch over why that is and how it affects our culture and where we are as a world. But what it does is it provides an immediate opportunity for us to lean into the idea of business value through content, to become the trusted source of interesting things. Now, that's a really interesting thing because in the context, we know that third-party cookies, third-party data is going away. And we need to lean into that. Because as we start to see things like GDPR, CCPA, LGPD, all of these acronyms for legislation that is going through various countries, these are only going to increase over time. Now, we haven't done it here in the US. Why? Well, because we've been occupied for the last 4 years with that other guy, and then we had COVID and all sorts of things, but it will return. I guarantee you it'll return, and it will return in a big way because third-party data is becoming increasingly difficult to track. In fact, only 17% of consumers believe that it's ethical to track people over different web properties. And 80% have said, if you track me without my knowledge, I will actually not only just turn you off, I will abandon you as a provider. It's coming, but we need not move away from it. We must lean into this idea of emotional data because third-party data disappearing. Second-party data will then become much less available to us, the kind of data you get at conferences, etc., because the value of first-party data is getting so increased. Now, here's the thing. It's not zero-party data. I hate this term. It's a ridiculous term. Zero-party data has nothing to do with it. It is first-party data that is valuable here. The only difference is why and how it was collected. First-party data that is emotional in the sense that it was trustingly, willingly given to you in exchange for value. Who does that? Media companies do that. They are willingly given first-party data in exchange for the content value. This is what I mean by operating as a media company. We can see this happening all over the place. Acquisitions are happening everywhere. We can see MailChimp's acquisition of Courier Media. We can see HubSpot acquiring The Hustle. All of these leaning into this idea of first-party data. Great example of this, Sykes Enterprises, consulting firm down in Florida. Now, the interesting thing is they really focus in on business process management and other kinds of consulting to financial services companies. What did they do? They acquired the Penny Hoarder magazine. Millions of subscribers, millions of visits every month. Why? Well, we can lean right on the CEO's statement as to why. He said, the insights, knowledge, and expertise that we get will not only help us enable consumers to make better decisions, but help our clients grow and strengthen their brands. In other words, our ability to have this first-party data is a differentiator for us in terms of being able to deliver value to our consumers. That's key. We can not only deliver better consulting to our clients, but we can help them deliver better experiences to their customers based on the knowledge we get from this first-party data. So the acquisition of that magazine for them was a critical competitive advantage. So the last of our 10 lessons learned here, number 9, lean into first-party data collection. Connect it. Connect those experiences and understand why they are giving it to you. And number 10, transform content into a business strategy. Not every company is going to have a content strategy, but every successful company will. So start transforming your content from a random siloed team of people producing digital assets into an incredible business strategy that drives value for your business. So what do we do with all that? How do I sort of deal with all of that? One, I want you to ask, is content as important as a product? In other words, is your business, is content still everybody's job and nobody's strategy? You have the opportunity now to create content and experiences that are as important to your business as your product. You create more of it than you do your product. You create more of it than you do your services. So why wouldn't content be as important to you as your product and treated in the same way that a media company treats it? Two, the measurability paradox. You can solve it. We have more technology and tools that we can throw a stick at these days to give us measurability. So this is why we have these tools, but the key is that we have to develop the objectives, shared objectives, in order to measure any sort of progress toward it. Why can't we seem to put ROI on content? Can we start adding in a planning process to get to shared objectives for content that can help us measure the cost? In other words, we can measure performance all day long. We can measure denominator all day long. What we can't measure is the numerator, how it was the cost of that content to be created in the first place. If we can measure both the numerator and the denominator, we get to profitability of content as a business strategy. And third, and maybe my favorite, is to ask your team, ask your boss, ask the group, what if we stopped producing content? Full stop. We stop producing content, we stop producing email, no more white papers, no more websites, no more nothing. No more content, no more social media anywhere. Who would miss it? Where are we differentiating with our experiences? Would we have someone call us and say, I miss your Friday afternoon newsletter. I missed the Friday afternoon post on Facebook where you have the kitten hanging from the tree saying, hang in there, baby. I miss all that. Or would we hear crickets? And if we'd hear crickets, like nobody would miss it, then we might rethink where we're actually publishing and how we're publishing our content to think through what it is we're actually doing. And this is really the key with all of it. How are you creating content as a strategy in 2022? I hope these 10 lessons can point you in the right direction, and I hope it becomes as important to you as your product. And if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I thank you so much for your time. I wish you the best of luck in 2022 and into 2023. And really, remember, it's your story. You tell it well. I'll see you soon.